Well, in conversations with inquisitive but not yet believing friends and neighbors, all kinds of questions about God are on the table. Our unbelieving friends and neighbors, they have all kinds of questions about God on the table. For some, their questions are theoretical. They're questions that they're happy to discuss at arm's length. They may even affirm their belief in God, but a God who is far, far away and unknowable. A God who only exists to stop the universe from imploding. Albert Einstein was one such believer in such a God. He believed in a distant but yet unknowable God. He said, "I believe in the God of Spinoza, who reveals himself in the orderly harmony of what exists, not in a God who concerns himself with the fates and actions of human beings." Some of our other friends and neighbors may go a step further. They may agree that there is a God, or many gods, and they are involved in the fates and actions of humanity. But they affirm this with a lingering suspicion. Whoever these gods may be, their involvement in human affairs amounts to party tricks. These gods are capricious like the gods of Greek or Norse mythology. They manipulate and toy with humanity for selfish amusement. And these friends of ours, these friends and neighbors, they wonder if the Christian God that we believe in is just more of the same. A God like the gods of the Greek and the Norse people, chasing his own amusement. These are some of the ways that our unbelieving friends and neighbors think about God, and perhaps yours also. But this morning, I want to venture a little further by asking a question that few of us ask, a question that is seldom asked. Say Christians are right, say we Christians are right, that God is actually near and he is knowable. I want to ask whether the Christian God is interested in our joy. Is the Christian God interested in the happiness of his creatures? Have you ever asked yourself that question? Have you been with a friend who has asked that question? I do not doubt this question may be very difficult for some of us to ask. That's because many of us have seen and experienced a great deal of sorrow in this life. And so we've become suspicious of God, and we've become suspicious about joy. Consequently, we're wondering whether the discussion about joy and happiness is appropriate in the Christian religion at all. And I do think it is appropriate. I think it's very appropriate that we talk about happiness, joy, and God this morning. And I think it's appropriate because our text speaks about it on more than one occasion. At the completion of their temple, the people of God celebrated the dedication of the house of God with joy. They kept the feast of unleavened bread for 7 days with joy. And all this joy among the people of God is said to be the result of the Lord who made them joyful. Joy is all over our passage, so I do think it is appropriate for us to talk about it this morning. So let's go after these two questions today. The first could be helpful to our not yet believing friends and neighbors who may be asking, does God involve himself with humanity and history? Does God, the God that Christians believe in, does he get involved in the day-to-day things of human life? Secondly, in so doing, does our God have an interest in the happiness of his creatures? These are the two questions that our passage helps us to investigate and also answer. Addressing the first question then, does our God involve himself with humanity and history? I want us to look at verse 14. God's people at this time, the returning exiles, had come to rebuild their temple, their church. And after making a very vigorous start, they endured decades of opposition, frustration, and spiritual apathy. Yet finally, spurred on by the preaching of Haggai and Zechariah, the people triumphed and they did complete their temple. And so the text says, the elders of the Jews built and prospered through the prophesying of Haggai the prophet and Zechariah the son of Iddo. They finished their building by decree of the God of Israel and by decree of Cyrus and Darius and Artaxerxes, king of Persia. And the phrase I do want us to pay attention to is this. They finished their building by decree of God. It is telling that comes first, that they finished their building by decree of God. The author here is at pains to show that the temple was rebuilt not exclusively owing to the human will or to tenacity or even the permissiveness of the kings of Persia. As important as all those factors are, rather the reason underneath all other reasons, the reason underneath it all, is that it was rebuilt because it was God's decree that the temple be rebuilt. And this does tell us that God is actually involved in the day-to-day things of human life. God is involved with humanity and history. To help us understand God's involvement, we briefly touched on the doctrine of providence last week. Just briefly touched on the doctrine of providence, that God governs everything wisely, first for the glory of his own name, and second for the ultimate blessing of his children. What this text makes explicit to us today is that God governed everything wisely, including all the people and all the political powers involved during that day, to ensure that the temple was rebuilt. God was the reason underneath all other reasons. He was the one governing all the people and all the kings of Persia and whoever else was involved to ensure that the temple would be rebuilt. And though it is true, there were people involved in the process. There were tradies on trials and there were officials doing official things that officials do. What really undergirds and what really drives the temple rebuild inevitably forward is God's decree. It is God's decree that is the reason underneath all other reasons that the temple is rebuilt. In simple terms, the idea here is that God has the power to direct everything that we know, everything that is created, everything that exists. He has the power to direct all those things to his appointed end. He has an idea in his mind of what he wants done in history, and he rules the world in such a way to make sure that that will happen. The truth of this is consolidated in Ephesians chapter 1, which speaks of God who works all things according to the counsel of his will, including will that the temple be rebuilt in the days of Ezra. And this partly answers our very first question. Does God involve himself with humanity and history? And the answer is clearly yes. God does involve himself with humanity and history. The fundamental reason the text gives for the temple being rebuilt is God's involvement. It is his decree being executed. That's why one brick was added upon another, because it is God's decree being executed. But then, the follow-up question to this could well be, isn't this exactly the kind of involvement of a God that our friends and neighbors are suspicious about? That God does get involved with humanity, but only to accomplish his pet projects, with no interest in the happiness of his creatures. So the text is true here, right? It shows us that God gets involved, but we're still left with the question, does God get involved with an interest in the happiness of his creatures? I'm going to try and answer that question in part, and hopefully more fully as we get toward the end of this sermon. The text does show God's involvement with humanity and in history, and it shows that his involvement is not arbitrary or for selfish amusements. Rather, God's involvement shows a purposeful regard for the good of his creatures. Let me explain how that is so. In this text, the purposeful sovereign decree of God to have the temple rebuilt enabled his people to rightly worship him once more. Remember, by this time in Ezra's history and in the history of the Old Testament, they had for decades, God's people had gone for decades without being able to come to God on God's terms, on the terms that God specified to Moses. But now, with God executing his decree, the temple was once again available for proper biblical worship. And we see this in verses 16 through to 18. As the people celebrated, the people made offerings, the people organized their worship to reflect what was written in the book of Moses. They were coming back to biblical worship because of what God had decreed to happen. And so we are right to understand that God's involvement with humanity and history is not arbitrary. He doesn't get involved for selfish amusements like that of the Greek or the Norse gods. Rather, the biblical God, the Christian God, has in mind an overarching good purpose for his people. And that purpose is to worship him wholeheartedly. God has a good purpose in mind. He wants to draw his people to true worship, and that is a good purpose for us to give our lives to. But if you've come from outside of the Christian world, or perhaps this is the first ever sermon that you've given yourself to, the idea of worshiping God may not strike you as a particularly good purpose for your life. It may not seem like it's full enough to live a life of worship toward the Lord. Perhaps in your mind, you're thinking that a better purpose for life might be to love your neighbor or to do unto others. That a humanitarian purpose for your life is far better than the one of worshiping God. If that's where your thinking is at, I would only ask, and I would humbly ask, are those actions of loving your neighbor and to do unto others not actions which flow most naturally from Christian worship rather than serving as a substitute for worship? And that the God who said, love your neighbor, is the one who prefaced that command with love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. And then love your neighbor as yourself. Or that the God who commands us to do unto others is the same God who insisted that doing good to others is no match for his exacting demands to be perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect. In all of this, all I'm trying to say is that worship, biblically defined, is a fitting and grand and full enough purpose for your life, for all of humanity. Something that God, even in Ezra's day, was eager to reintroduce to his people. And though it will take some time to learn and discuss what we mean by worship according to the Bible, it's hard to deny that the old thinkers of Christianity were right when they said that man's chief end is to glorify God and to enjoy him forever. It's hard to deny that they were onto something when they coined that phrase. And it's this little phrase on worship that I'd like to explore a little further with you today. Remember, our first question was, does God involve himself with humanity and history? To which our passage answered yes. And our second question is, in so doing, does our God have an interest in the happiness of his creatures? The old theologians of the Christian church answered that question affirmatively. If you were to ask them, the God that you have come to know through the pages of Scripture, would you say that he has an interest in the happiness of his creatures? The old theologians would smile at you and say, of that there can be no doubt. Of course he has an interest in the happiness of his creatures. And that's why they summarize that man's chief end, the thing that would ultimately bring mankind most happiness, is to glorify God and to enjoy him forever. And here's how our passage affirms this same truth. As God moved, enabled, and decreed for his people to rebuild the temple in order to worship him or to glorify him, the most natural way in which they did that worshiping, the most natural way in which they glorified God, was to enjoy him, was to find joy in their doing of worship. This truth has already been noted at the completion of the building of their temple, where worship could once again be done faithfully and biblically. They celebrated with joy. They kept the feast with joy. And they knew that this joyful worship was not an emotional state that they just worked themselves into, but a gift. Their joy was a gift from the Lord who made them joyful. Surely this demonstrates to us that worshiping God and joy are mutually supportive and reciprocating acts, meaning that God moves and enables and decrees for us to worship him. And when he does that, our joy is close at hand. When he calls us to worship him, joy is close at hand. And this then answers the second question that we have been asking. When our God moves and he involves himself with humanity, does he do so with a genuine interest in the happiness of his creatures? And I think the answer, at least in this text, is yes. When God moved his people to go and worship, he also gave them joy in the task of worshiping. What I've labored to communicate this morning may catch some of us by surprise. It may seem a little novel to talk this way about God and worship. For one, it may never have occurred to us that God has an interest in our happiness. We've never even dared to ask the question, is God interested in the happiness of his creatures? We have long believed that God is dour, miserly, and reserved when it comes to positive affections like joy and happiness. But that is a trick being played on us. If that's where our minds are at, it is a trick being played on us. It is a trick that the great C.S. Lewis understood when he wrote his fictitious work, the Screwtape Letters. And in those letters, he imagines a devil who is determined to discourage God's people. And even that devil acknowledged that God is a hedonist at heart. All those fasts and vigils, this is the devil talking, all those fasts and vigils and stakes and crosses are only a facade, are only like foam on the seashore. Out at sea, out in his sea, there is pleasure and more pleasure. He makes no secret of it. At his right hand are pleasures forevermore. Oh, he has filled the world full of pleasures. Lewis's point was simply this: God has made no secret whatsoever of intending happiness for his creatures. Rather, it is we, the creatures, who are the ones slow to believe that this is true of God. Yet here in our text, we have made this discovery. God shows great interest in the happiness of his people, so much so that he moved the kingdoms of the world and the stale hearts of his people to enjoy true worship once more. For others, this combination of worship and joy comes as a surprise because we never imagined that worship and joy could be found in the same room together. Alas, we have assumed that worship is a church thing, while happiness is something we ourselves have to attend to without the help of God. Of this, John Calvin once noted, while all men seek after happiness, scarcely 1 in 100 looks for it from God. But is it not the case here in our passage that worship and joy are experienced in one and the same moment, and both come as a gift from God? This seems to be at the very heart of our text. God involves himself with humanity for a good purpose, and that purpose is to introduce his people to joy in true worship. This was a lesson that the people of Ezra's generation had to learn in stages. And this is likely the way that we will learn it also in our Christian lives. The truth doesn't just land on us all at once. We learn, we grow, we mature, we discover new things that the Lord would teach us. At first, in Ezra's generation, they burnt very brightly with a great zeal for God and committed themselves to the temple rebuild. But that zeal eventually cooled off and gave way to some 20 years of spiritual decline and dissatisfaction. But God persisted. God persists in bringing joy to his people in worship. In time, he taught them his decree to bring them back to faithful biblical worship and to grant them joy therein for their good. It was for their good. Perhaps this gives each one of us hope to discover and experience this truth for ourselves. It certainly does for me. It certainly does encourage me, this text, to discover this truth afresh again. I do not speak as one as an expert on Christian joy, but one who finds the truth compelling, that the chief end of man is indeed to glorify God and to enjoy him forever. I do find that compelling, a compelling vision that's big enough for your life and mine. In terms of immediate application, the text gives us a solid pointer. In verse 19, we're told, on the 14th day of the first month, the returned exiles kept the Passover. Passover was their reminder that God rescued them from a hostile slavery in Egypt. In commemoration, a lamb was slaughtered, and they remembered the significance of this slaughtered lamb. Its blood painted on the entrance door of their forefathers' houses before the angel of the Lord executed divine judgment on all in the land who disregarded the blood of the slaughtered lamb. Of this, the New Testament tells us, Jesus is our Passover lamb. He was slaughtered. By his blood, we are spared from divine judgment also. As the saints of Ezra's day celebrated their deliverance from slavery, so too we celebrate our deliverance that Jesus won for us, a hostile slavery to sin. Even in this act of worship, we are afforded opportunity to eat and drink when we come to this table we are afforded the opportunity to come, eat and drink with joy at the Lord's table. Let us apply ourselves to this. Let me pray for us and we will go to the Lord's table together.